it okay if we sit down, the people in the back, or?
Would you want us to stand?
I,
You've been standing for ages.
no, that's fine. Just my calf.
Before we start, there's just a couple of things I wanted to say. It's great to be back, and there's something that in the field of positive psychology, and positive psychology is the field of the science of human flourishing. It's defined by Angela Duckworth as that. And I think it's a really simple, great definition. Martin Seligman is probably the main founder of the positive psychology movement, and he has often talked about the importance of meaning and how positive emotion is essential for happiness, flourishing. Flow states are essential, but a sense of meaning and purpose is the most important part of a healthy science, of a healthy psychology. And he said very often that people, you mentioned children just now, and he mentions that often when you have children, your sense of meaning goes up, but your level of positive emotion goes down. And I had twins 22 months ago, and I can just say that my level of sense of meaning in life has gone right up, and my level of positive emotion has gone right down. But what I will say is I'm happier than I've ever been. So it's very interesting to see that hedonic element of happiness is important, but it's nowhere near the most important part. And so just from my own experience, it's been great to see what has been preached at me to experience and see that that's correct. The other thing someone mentioned, I didn't see who it was, mentioned recovery earlier. I started my career as an addictions counsellor. So the recovery scene is very dear to my heart, and a core part of my purpose and who I am as a professional. So just whoever that was, if they want to have a chat about any of that afterwards, I'd be very happy to, always happy to talk about that. So I just wanted to say it's great to be back, and the reason I've been away is young children, twins.
Take time.
it's the most full-on thing I've ever done, and it's amazing. But it's the most beautiful thing I think about young children is watching a consciousness grow in front of your eyes, not in the matter of days, but in the matter of hours. You see these seismic shifts every day, and there's something really beautiful about that. And people don't talk about that so much. And I think it's incredible to watch the autonomy of someone grow, and also to witness how little I have to do with what they're doing. From such a young age, it's self-driven what they're doing. And I'm a guide, I'm stopping them hurting themselves, but they're the ones who are choosing the books to read, playing with the tower, all these sorts of things. It's amazing to watch. I recommend it to anyone.
Yes. I want to reintroduce myself. So I told Josh when we were talking in the back that I never knew that I should have been something that had to do with philosophy. I missed it completely when I was a teenager because I was asking all the right questions, but what I was told back is like, this is not important. This is just philosophizing. In Hebrew, if you say I'm philosophizing, it's actually detrimental. It's like it's bullshit. It's let's get on with it and get into real things. Philosophizing too much makes no sense. So I took that and I said, okay, I'm going to be an engineer. So I lived about 2 decades with this gap of like, I'm an engineer and I'm building software and I'm becoming a manager and so on and so forth, but always like a hole in my soul that this is not what I was supposed to do. I mean, there's something deeper that I never fulfilled. So I was writing a lot, I was reading a lot, and it was like I was interested in quantum mechanics and physics and like higher ideas. I thought the truth is in the matter, so maybe if I'll read enough physics, I'll understand that. And then at the age of 40, somebody introduced me to Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged. And for me, it was not just, this is a nice book. This was like somebody, you can imagine, like someone opened a big door and said, welcome. There's a path that you never saw, nobody presented to you, that exists. And you can think about philosophy and the big ideas in a very scientific way that makes sense. It's not all subjective. It's not like we say this and they say that, and who knows what's right, and so on and so forth. So my passion since, and it went through iterations, is to almost like leverage the fact that what I've trained myself to become is a doer, an engineer that makes things happen. I build products, I build companies, I know how to get things done. But then rebuild another foundation that I've invested over a decade now in my life, which is to learn the philosophy, the physics of life. And so my reintroduction is something like I am now dedicating my life to building almost like a bridge between philosophy and what people call psychology, which is getting interested in you, in each and every one of you. It's like somebody created the principles, the equations, and now on top of that sits a science that says if that's, and I think positive psychology for me, in a way, rediscovered philosophy. It says, oh, our purpose is to be happy. What does that mean? It requires meaning. We need to define a standard for flourishing. What is human thriving? What does it look like? What are its prerequisites? And now, if you give psychology a solid foundation and a standard by which you say, I'm moving towards a goal of a state of flourishing of that human being, then you can really do something effective. And I think there's a lot of amazing minds in psychology, but it's like when physics got lost with quantum mechanics. Well, once it lost its standard, well, we're trying to understand reality as it is and not what we think or recreate reality with all kinds of thought experiments. Is once physics lost its standard, it went dark for decades. I mean, really went completely lost with physics because we lost the standard. So for me, it's fascinating to see how the world of philosophy, good philosophy. The problem is that most philosophy is garbage, and so if you have to pick and choose the things that are really good in it, and if you apply that to the purpose of human flourishing, you get something that is somewhere between philosophy and the intersection between philosophy and psychology, which is where I am today. And that's what I'm trying to bridge. So it's great to be next to a professional psychologist who understands that science, and me having one foot in philosophy, one foot in psychology, and trying to build that bridge in between.
I mean, I have to say in my clinical practice, I have to rely on the philosophy, almost as much as the psychology.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because if someone comes to me and says, they don't talk in the language we're using. They're just like, I'm depressed, I'm unhappy, I can't stop doing this, whatever it is. You will come up against a philosophical wall because some people don't believe that they should be happy. They don't believe that that's right. You know, it may come from a religious angle, it may come from a sort of very almost like we might call it the wacky left angle. Like, why am I even thinking about myself? I should always be thinking about everyone else. And I think one of the biggest issues in the current positive psychology movement is this confusion between benevolence and altruism, which is that when most people refer to altruism, they're talking about benevolence, but that's what they think it is. And that's one of the big philosophical areas where it really needs help. That's, I think, that whole movement, it's where the biggest flaw is. One of the most exciting and cool things about the whole sort of rebirth you sort of alluded to just then is that the hero of the positive psychology movement is Aristotle. He's the one who keeps getting referred to as the father of positive psychology. And if we can have something similar happen in psychology that we had when Aristotle was rediscovered in the sort of 13th century, that could be amazing. And maybe we're on the tip of something really fantastic here, because we can argue that Rand is the heir to Aristotle. Mm-hmm. And I'd also say, a huge amount of the work that I do relies on objectives. And it comes down to the simplicity of how Rand explains things that I then speak to people about in very simple terms, and people just get it so quickly. values hierarchies, things like this, purpose, goal setting. These are all things that people are sort of desperate to hear about. And tell me more, tell me more. I run groups in treatment centres, and one of the things that I repeat this story if you've heard it a few times, but it might be interesting for you to hear is I'll sometimes will give a handout on quotations of happiness, it'll be Aristotle, and I'll put Ayn Rand in there as well. And many times I'll get people say, "That's amazing. She's awful, but that's amazing." And then I might say, "Have you ever read it?" No, 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 no. Just I've heard that she's awful. But that, you know, like to say I love you first time I say I, something like that, people are like blown away by it, or that loving someone selfishly is the greatest tribute you can pay that person. And now that's not the exact words, but that's summing it up. And people are just like, wow, that's what it is. I get it now. And so it's been injectivism been invaluable. And also talking about foundations of psychology. The two kind of what they're not technically axioms, but they're almost like axioms of psychology that I help people to understand. And I think this is essential for any branch of psychology, actually, is an emphasis on two things. One is in Harry Binswanger and co, always referring to something they call the crow. But in mainstream psychology, it's referred to as working memory. And having an understanding of working memory of how much you can hold in mind at any one time is essential for clients to understand, but also clinicians to understand in terms of teaching, because much of the work is teaching, and you don't want to overload your clients with explanations of this, read this, if you know that, and they're lost. I always say, do you remember the teacher at school that just wrote notes and notes and notes and notes and notes on the board, and after 5 minutes you were just zoning out because they had no understanding of how much we can hold in mind at any one time? So that, I think, is an essential for any form of psychology, but in terms of the psychology of happiness, that we can only hold a certain amount in mind. Steve Jobs, we keep coming back to that guy. If you notice, all his talks, it's threes. Everything is in threes. And including his most famous talk about the iPhone being 3 in 1. But everybody remembers those things. I think what that does for someone's self-esteem when they can remember something. You know, just a kid can remember and hold something in mind. So a good understanding of working memory of the crow is essential for a psychology of happiness, amongst other things. The other thing is how the brain works in terms of memory and networking. We are not like a computer. We're not like the memory on your laptop. You have ARCUK and you double click on that, and there's January, and you double click on that, and there's invoices, and you double click on that, and you know, and you go in and out. It doesn't work like that at all. Our brain or our system works through associative networking. You know, I say to a room right now, white, and each of you will have a very different association to the word white immediately. Some of you would have gone to snow, some of you might have thought of a polar bear, some of you might have thought of this. It doesn't really matter, but the fact is, your associations, your automatic associations, if we understand associative networking, we can understand what goes wrong, why you can be so triggered, why things can be so difficult for you to grasp. We need to break a lot of those automatic associations. So if we have a foundation of understanding associative networking and understanding working memory, we've got very strong foundations to create programs, to create methods, and to create techniques that we can then use to intervene into either doing great and want to do even better, or doing really badly and want to improve. The principles are the same. And those are a couple of foundations that I'm always trying to bring into the work that I've learned from, well, initially really Harry Binswanger, but ultimately via Ayn Rand. And that those have been essential for helping people understand.
I think, maybe if I extend it, I think the power of Ayn Rand is that she's both a novelist and a philosopher. And she puts her money where her mouth is. I mean, she just tell you this and that is true, but she shows you how it is. When I read so I finished the Atlas Shrugged, and then I read The Fountainhead, and I felt like The Fountainhead kind of kicked my butt so hard, because it was suddenly I had a role model. And going back to what you said, Josh, about positive psychology, it's she gave me a standard for human thriving. And you know how people say that the most clarifying question they can ask is that was like, what would Howard Rourke do? Or what would my version of Howard Rourke would do? And I think the power of that is because she gives you a standard that is a fiction. And she says, but that's the principle. Now the question is how you're going to take that abstract principle and build your version of that. What is my architecture? Well, first, if you know anything about Howard Rourke, he's passionate. He's consumed with his vision. It's like, what does that mean to me? And then the character, the way he carries himself, and the ability to persevere. What does that mean to me? The sacrifices, quotation, right? Because again, he does things that he calls the most, selfish thing I can do. But the sacrifices they make in order to not compromise on his vision. And then being so focused on values. This scene with Tui, when Tui comes to him and says, so what do you think of me? I'm your enemy. And he says, but I don't. Was kind of blew me away by saying, why are you focusing on what other people think? Why are you focusing on the negative? Why aren't you completely focusing your mind on the positive and the value seeking, rather than all the people, the naysayers and people trying to attack you and have conflicts with you? Just don't think of them. So going back to the idea that Rand, for me, gave a standard that if you talk about positive psychology is the science of human flourishing and thriving, for me, she's like, and here's how it looks. So now if I break down, and that's what I've been doing in the last couple of years, is really breaking down and verbalizing, what does it mean to be in a state of thriving? So I go through several elements, but I'll give you the key ones. Well, first, happiness for me is, it's climate, not a weather, right? I'm not waking up miserable today and happy tomorrow. And if you ask people on the street, and this is why I hate a lot of psychological research that says, oh, we've measured this and this and that, and then people reported that they're happier. It's like, what do they mean when they say happier? Is that like how I feel today? That's not happiness. So state of joy, maybe momentary joy is what you're measuring, but what is the standard by which you even define that term? So I think happiness is a very complicated term that actually tries to define a human state of thriving in a climate of thriving. I mean, I'm a happy person. I might have bad days, awful days, amazing days, creative days, non-productive days, and so on. But I know that the trajectory of my life is going in a direction that I'm happy with. I know I'm on my path. I have a lot of things that add meaning to my life. And I have this exercise in my happiness team called the Value Galaxy, which is really trying to visualize on a wall all the things that make my life worth living. And those are the building blocks of my state of happiness and meaning, because without those things, I won't wake up in the morning. There's no reason, right? My relationships, my productive creativity, my health and rejuvenation, my, the wealth I have, the possessions I have, everything you can think about different categories of values. And so once you define that happiness is that state of thriving that has different elements of it, the foundation of it is having values. And for me, when people talk about meaning, it's almost like, here's my consciousness, here's reality. This thing, and you talked about your twins, right? You see that with kids all the time. This thing reacts to some things here. I don't know what it is about drawing that my 3-year-old son became obsessed with and never stopped doing it for like 6-7 hours a day until today. He's a character designer in a gaming company. And the way his hobbies are the same exact thing as his profession. It's like he wants to rest, he does the same thing. So I don't know why my middle child had nothing to, she never picked up a pen. It was all about being social. And my third is completely different. I mean, they're all like have their own temperament, their own hardware, and the way they design the hardware, they program the hardware to respond to different things. And that almost like magical things of waves of meaning that connect some activities and some people and some environments that I respond to is my meaning. I mean, the thing that I can find meaning in would be the most boring thing to you or scary things to you, right? So the idea of I respond to something is something we need to learn, which is to become what I call to become a valuer, to pay attention and understand that values in your life are the meaning. Can you hold them? Can you say, oh, I just identified another value. That's going to add to meaning. Like I just had twins. Whoa, my God, I never thought about how much, I bought a race car. I just bought a race car. For the first time, I own a race car. I always rented one. And that adds a lot of meaning because now I get to talk about how do we design the race car and what we're going to put in the race car. I got to that only by understanding that this is a value to me and I can verbalize why it is. So it's a long-winded way of saying that, and maybe tomorrow if you come to my talk, I'll give you more detail, but I can actually break down this concept of happiness into components of having values, having the character and the clarity to pursue my values. And it's a state of mind. It's almost like a strategic view of my life and its trajectory into saying, yes, you're doing a great job living in a life that goes from a point to a point, and maybe it's going to change, right? And it's going to have different elements. This is my journey. But I said it in the last talk, I can condense all of it into a sentence that at the end of the day, I can say, I'm good at living as me. Because there's a lot goes into that. I think self-knowledge and the art of introspection is something that as a culture we've lost completely. If you think of what would it mean to be educated back in ancient Greece or in what they call the Jeffersonian school, there was a lot of time of introspection, quiet time to say, what just happened? Was it good? And really have the ability to look inside and evaluate if what's going on is really good. We don't have that quiet time anymore. So all those elements are required to achieve a state of thriving that is way more complicated than most people assume. And so if you go out in the street, and this is what scares me about sometimes research that is done in psychology, and you ask, are you happy? Most people say, yes, I'm very happy. And then if you go have a drink with them, so they're not really happy. I mean, they don't know what they're doing. They're enslaved to beauty and altruism, and they have a continuous, gap between what they think is moral and good and where they are in their lives. There's like those contradictions, and they suffer from depression and ups and downs. They end up in clinics without even knowing what to ask. It's like, just get this pain out of my life without having a standard for the good. So I think what Rand gives us is almost like the physics of happiness. And she was so brilliant that she not just defined it philosophically, but she shows us how it's done. Now, you have to read it right. Everybody that I recommend, let's read The Fountainhead. I said, read that book, but always have a question in his mind. It's like, why is he like that? How did he become like that? Because Rand doesn't give you the backstory of how Howard Rourke became one. And like, we were not born Howard Rourke. She was, by the way, if you read her biographical interviews, she was like at 8, she knew exactly what she wanted to do. She started practicing. I mean, my son was born like this. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. He just went on a path. It was clear. Some people are born like a Steve Jobs, or most of us are confused. So that the way I interact with Rand is I try to see her as both as a physicist, but also as a practitioner. And what I'm trying to add is, and I don't know, maybe I'll ask you if what I'm doing is psychology, but I'm trying to build that bridge to say, and here is what you do. Okay, if you don't want to be a physicist and go into the equations, that's fine. Be an engineer. Let me give you the equation. Let me give you the manual to say, do this, do this, do this, do that. And yeah, the result will be a better state of thriving. And I hope that's what psychologists are trying to do. I just don't know if they have the philosophical foundation for
I mean, I really, one thing I'll say, right, what you said at the end is I rather glibly say, but it makes people smile. If you do these things, you'll be happy whether you like
that. Whether you like it or not.
Whether you like it or not, you'll be happy. If you do these things, you will be happy whether you like it or not. And that often grabs people's attention.
Yeah.
Because I've cut my teeth amongst some of the most cynical, resistant people there are. So I've had to learn methods. I'm really pleased that you mentioned that there. How many people in the put your hand up in the room if you know what I mean when I say the term codependence? So a few of you. In all of 95% of the work that I do when I'm working with groups, the fundamental main issue at the end of a week of working with people is this term codependence. And most people don't know what it means, but it's a pathological condition characterized by two main traits. One, self-denial. Two, caretaking of others. And our caretaking is very different from caring. Caretaking is when you don't allow or you try to stop someone else's autonomy. I know what's best for you, I know what you need to do, and you either do that passively or aggressively. But caretaking is constantly always trying to fix
something. Of your mom?
Yeah, well, certain mums fall into that.
I'm joking.
But no, it's just, but it is, there's a lot of truth to that. And self-denial is the other main trait of this term codependence. And people will say to me, wow, this is my core issue here is that, how do I get out of this? I don't want to be like this anymore. And what you'll find is that people who are very codependent is they're always putting a lower value above a higher value. So if you bring them down to this, the fundamental that you mentioned, looking at the values and looking at their core values, they'll always see that I love, let's just say, Tal loves racing cars, and you love playing the drums, right? Mm-hmm. And I say to you, when did you last play the drums? And you say, oh, I haven't played the drums for a decade now. How comes? Well, I'm always trying to make sure that such and such at work is okay, and I've got to go and help these people do this, and I just got no time for that. And you look into it, and do you even like those? No, I don't like those things. It's like that's what a sacrifice is. When Tal said sacrifice earlier, he actually meant a value that's at the top of your values hierarchy, and you're working towards that, even if it's difficult and a struggle. But you'll find that people who are suffering from or displaying codependent traits all the time is they're always putting a lower value above what really are their core values. And some people don't even know what their values are. So you have to start with that. What are the things that you just like, you say to someone? And at the end, they're like, well, tell me more. What can I do? How do I work with this? And there's a couple of there's Melody Beattie's book, Codependence No More, that still really stands up. But I'll always say, read the fountain. There is no better concretization of Rankel's second-handness, but in psychology they call it codependence. And you'll see from that book, I think is the best psychology book I could ever give a client. There's a couple of things that you said there that are really interesting. One is psychologists will very rarely use the term happiness. Not because they don't know what it is, primarily because most people don't know what it is. And so I'll do this example. I'll say, okay, so what is happiness to room people? Some people will go, well, it's feeling joy in the moment. I'll go, okay, yeah, okay. So I say, okay, so like, it's a positive emotion. Yeah, that's what it is. It's a strong positive emotion. That's what happiness is. And I go, okay, so how about if I say to you, you ask me, am I happy? And I go, yeah. And it's, what kind of a day you have? Oh, terrible. My most awful day. But no, I'm happy. My life is, I'm a happy guy. Just got a parking ticket this morning, and the kids got up really early, and there's zero positive emotion in the last week. But I'm happy. And they'll go, oh yeah, I get that. Oh, I can see that. Like, so what is happiness? There's the real struggle for people to understand that. So that's actually why there's an emphasis on the word flourishing, because nearly everyone knows what flourishing is.
It's a state.
It's a state.
Flourish.
Yeah, it's a state, and happiness is really a state. It's so that's, I think, something that a lot of psychologists do know what happiness is, but they just struggle. It's just like, okay, let's just call it flourishing, because everyone is so confused about what it means.
But do you see that, I'm interested, do you see in the field of psychology where psychologists do not agree on the standard of human flourishing? Because it does require a philosophical view of...
100%. And you say it bugs, I mean, what really bugs me is when they say things like, Denmark is the happiest country.
Right.
And
there's
like, and what do you mean by that? What, and people go, well, it's an average of this and that and the other. Well, it doesn't work like that. That's not what it's your happiness. It's my happiness. It's an individual's happiness. It's not a collective of happiness. Now we can have societies that make it easier for you to flourish and more difficult to flourish, and you have more opportunity. That's a different thing. Another thing you mentioned about, which I find fascinating, is you say that your son knew exactly what he had, his kind of values very early on, what he wants to do, and then you mentioned your daughter was not interested in drawing at all. And I have identical twins. They have exactly the same DNA. They are completely different in temperament, in what they're into, how they respond to things, how they talk, completely different. It's absolutely extraordinary. So there's this third key part, which it's very interesting that it's beginning to slip back. Psychology is in a much better state than it was 30 years ago. It's probably in the best state it's ever been. You mentioned introspection. People don't use that word, but what is absolutely huge industry is the mindfulness industry. And what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is a term that covers introspection, extrospection, and interoception. And it's an emphasis on all three of those. And a huge part of good mindfulness work, because there's a lot of terrible mindfulness work, is what's going on in my thinking? What's the causes of my thinking? What am I feeling right now? What was I thinking? There's these techniques that people, I remember Harry Binswanger saying, it's amazing that people are just using the word mind again in mindfulness. So that was a tremendous step that has been accepted.
What is that third element of mindfulness that you mentioned?
So there's introspection, extroception, and interoception. So interoception is the capacity to know what's going on inside your body. So I might say to you right now, how fast is your heart beating? And you bring awareness to your heart. What's going on in your knee? What's going on? If you don't have good interoceptive skills, you cannot flourish. Are you hungry? I don't know. If you don't have good interoceptive skills, you can get in all sorts of trouble in the office. You can burn out. Interoception is a huge and key element. As long as, and I will often look at clients and say, how's your or in my head, how's their introspective skills? What are their extroceptive skills? What are their interoceptive skills? And people have deficits in those areas sometimes. It's a good thing to look at.
How much time do we have? Because I want to see if we can. So we have time. Okay. Can we go to the topic of feelings or emotions?
Yeah, please do.
One of the key breakthroughs that I had individually, I mean, just for my own quality of life, is when Rand talks about the mechanism and the idea that a feeling is kind of a non-verbal communication that you get from the subconscious mind to the conscious mind, where behind that emotion there's a value judgment. that is it's not available to you because it's automatized. And I remember that I was trying to understand what it means and trying to reverse engineer all the emotions that I have in my life to say, where's the value judgment? And realizing that a lot of the value judgments that are behind my emotions are irrational. So I used introspection. I call it the 7-question introspection guide to almost act like a detective, to try and reverse engineer everything that happens. So I give an example in one workshop. So it goes like that. So I'm in so the first question in my 7-question introspection guide is, what happened? Give me the facts, right? So the first one is, here I am in the airport, hugging my daughter. She's leaving to Israel to enlist herself to the Israeli army. And I feel really bad. She's tearing up, I'm tearing up, and that's what happened. Okay, so what did I feel? Second question. And so now the challenge is to name the feeling, because there's a dictionary of feelings. People really have a very small vocabulary of feelings, because the richer it is, the richer your experiences. So it's like, what am I feeling? Am I feeling anger? No, it's not anger. I'm not angry at her. It's more like a combination of frustration and helplessness. This is what I'm feeling, a frustration and helplessness. And then the question is, why am I feeling that feeling? And that's like an immediate response of the reason why I'm feeling that. It's like, because she's not listening to what I was telling her about the mistake of going back to Israel, where I actually moved out of. I gave her so many other options to working in the Silicon Valley and opening up. We all knew she didn't want to go to college. So like, don't go to college, but go to work, and you're so talented, so charismatic. Why go back to Israel and go to the armies? It doesn't make any sense. So the frustration was, she's not listening to my advice. And helplessness is like, I'm the parent and I can do nothing about it. She has her own choice. Now, the fourth question is really hard, which is, what is the value judgment that is behind my emotion or my evaluation? And the value judgment is like an abstraction of what the reason why I'm feeling. As I said, okay, the standard I'm applying is that kid should listen to me. I'm a 50-year-old, she's an 18-year-old, and she should be thinking like me and accepting my value judgment because I need to be telling her what to do. That's really what's going on. I am applying a standard. The frustration I feel is because of the standard that she's not listening to me. Now, the fifth question is it objective? Is it true? And the answer, it's not. I mean, she's her own person. She has her own wants. I don't know how to live like her. She knows. Maybe she will thrive in the Israeli army. Maybe that's what she's looking for. She has her own path. She's forging it. All I need to do is to be a supportive parent. So what do you do when you realize that your whole emotion cycle is invalid? Or not invalid, irrational. I mean, it's not good. So the next question I ask myself in that introspection guide is like, okay, what should I do? Now that I've realized that my frustration and helplessness is just irrational, I should be feeling something else. So the first thing I would advise you all to do is, I call it talk to your 4-year-old or talk to yourself in the shower, which is the ability to retrain your subconscious mind to change your value judgments by saying, it's not good, Tal, that you're thinking as yourself as a parent who needs to tell his kids what to do, otherwise you're frustrated. It's not the right way to think. Be more benevolent, be more curious, ask more questions instead of you should, right? And after a while of a month telling myself that, I really changed the way I think. It's almost like subconscious mind is now reacting to what I'm talking to it about. So I decided to call her and say, I love you. I'm going to support you. It's your decision. I hope it works out, and so on. You can imagine the positive response. And the last question I usually ask is, what did I learn from this? What can I extract as a more kind of a meta level underline? So what is your view, or in psychology in general, what emotions are the role and the whole management. This is my engineering view of a tool to validate my emotions and then manage them as I need. How would you look at it from a more of a professional standpoint?
That's a great question. I mean, first of all, do people know what Tal and I are talking about when we say value judgments? That our emotions are caused by prior value judgments. But anyone here doesn't know what we're talking about there. Okay, so I'll make it really simple and concrete. If a bear runs in the room now, what is going to be the emotional response from, I'd say, 90% of people in the room? Fear. Why?
Risk of loss of life.
Risk of loss of life. So you know something about bears, and because of that, you make a judgment in relation to your values, your life, and an emotion is generated. You fear, and you'll have a variety of responses. There'll be fight, flight, freeze, dissociation. There'll be a variety of types of response, but that response will be driven by the fear because you know something about bears. I've got my twins, particularly if bear came in and Daisy sees the bear, she will run towards that bear, 100%. Because one, she loves her teddy bears, and two, she's mad. But she will run towards that bear because she sees that bear and she has a value judgment. Oh, bear. Fun, cuddly. She doesn't know otherwise. So she will not have the same emotional response until she learns about bears. And this is why we always say that all our emotional responses are driven by prior value judgments that we've made. And the only way to change them is because they become automatized over time. I'm 46. Unpicking my value judgments is a lot harder than unpicking a 2-year-old's. So it requires effort, and that's something that it can't just sort of magically happen. You have to do things like what Tal was talking about, go through stages. Now, all your emotions really have, all the various different types of emotion have 2 roles really. They either attract you or they're an aversion to something. Now, there's other people use slightly different phrases to that, but I got that from Andrew Huberman at Stanford. He said emotions either attract us or an aversion. And they do very different things as well, emotions. So someone who's written some good work about emotions, if you're interested on a more technical level, is Lisa Feldman Barrett's book on how emotions are made. And she comes to the same conclusion, that they come down to value judgments. And the whole CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy scene is based around this. And that was one of when psychology started to get a bit better, was when they noticed that there was causal elements to all of this. So what is an emotion? Emotion is kind of like a cognitive somatic bridge in some ways. It has this cognitive element, although and guides your cognition, but is a result of your cognition, but it manifests in the body. And you might say, well, what do you mean? I say, well, okay, where do we tend to feel sadness? In our throats and in our eyes. Where do we tend to feel anxiety? Here. Where do we tend to feel excitement? Here. Excitement and anxiety are very interesting emotions because they're both driven by the same neuromodulator, norepinephrine. And that's why people become very confused about whether they're anxious or whether they're excited. Or you can actually be anxious and excited at the same time about the same thing. Mm-hmm. And you might think, what? And I say, well, you're going on your first date with someone you really like. You're really excited about it and you're really anxious. I don't want to mess this up.
Or maybe a change that.
Yeah. So we can have, and that's why people can get very confused. And there's some very sad stories about particularly women who've been repressed for a long, long time in certain societal arrangements, that when they started to get their freedom again, they didn't know that what they were feeling was excitement. They thought it was anxiety, so they always tried to shut it down. Mm-hmm. Emotions are what make us act. They, as I say, they make us go towards something or away from something. Now, something that's really crucial to understand about emotions is there aren't any bad emotions. When we talk about negative emotions and positive emotions, what do negative emotions tend to do to us physiologically? If I'm anxious, what happens to my body language? I tend to go inwards. What the negative emotion is doing is it's cutting off all the noise, because I've got to pay a tax bill and I've got to work out how to pay that tax bill by a certain deadline. So I need to focus all my attention inwards and cut out all that. So that brilliant for stopping me getting lost into other things. So it shuts everything off, and then I get the solution, I pay it, good. That's something that I want to experience, not something I want to run away from or drink away from or numb out from. That anxiety was a positive, it was a value to me. It got that stuff done. The anger allows me to right that injustice. Sadness allows me to pay tribute to something that was of value to me and maybe allow me to explore those values and recreate more of it. So there is no bad emotion. What do positive emotions do? When I experience joy, what happens to me? My shoulders go back, my head goes up. They allow me to integrate better. I take in more information, my hearing gets better. They're very different positive emotions. They're all about creativity. It's a complete myth that you need to be a tortured artist to create your best work. My theory around this, and one of my favorite artists is Bob Dylan. I think he's a genius lyricist. And one of his most revered albums is called Blood on the Tracks, which is all about the breakup of his marriage. And everyone's like, look, he had to suffer. But it turned out he wrote it a couple of years after the marriage dissolved. And I think that a lot of artists make their best work when they've come out of something and they're beginning to get hope again.
They have the perspective.
They got the perspective and distance, and they're not flooded with negative emotion anymore. They're actually moving on, but the trouble was in the back, was fresh in their mind, so it's a subject of the art, but they're actually not in that place anymore. They're actually moving towards something else. That's just a theory I have. But positive emotions open us up. Barbara Fredrickson, who's written a lot about positive emotions, talks about the broadening and building effect of positive emotion, what it does for us. So if you want, and there's a lot of experiments with children on creativity. If you want, with paper clips, there's a famous experiment with asking kids to come up with as many creative solutions and things they can do with paper clips. And what they do is they just have the control group just do this, and then they have the other group where they generate a load of positive emotion. You can read about how that happens, and the difference is startling. So, positive emotions allow us to, you get on that buzz and they tie into flow states, and there's all sorts of things to go into that. But negative emotions allow us to almost get singular stuff done and quickly. And positive emotions allow us to open up and integrate and take information in and continue to create. So that emotions, in many ways, will allow us to really live, but they are the response to value judgments. And there's something else that I think is also essential if you want a good psychology of happiness, is we have to stop calling cognitions feelings. And this is something that in my work I'm always trying to do. When I'm in a treatment center, I can be very direct. When I'm with a one-to-one client, I have to be much more careful with this. Just the nature of the context and the contracts people sign. But if I'm running a treatment group and we're doing a feelings check-in at the beginning, and Tal goes, "Oh, I'm Tal, I'm feeling stupid." I'll go, "That's not a feeling, Tal." You go, "Well, what do you mean?" No, well, when you tell yourself you're stupid, what do you feel? And usually, I don't know anything, shame or anger. But we do this all the time. And there was an interview where Ayn Rand busts herself doing that. She's, I feel this, or I think this. But we've got to stop calling, I feel fat, I feel stupid, I feel tired, because the problem this does in relationships is huge. And teenagers are the best at this, you'll see in a sec. But if I say to someone, I feel stupid, you have to make up in your mind what I'm feeling. You have to.
Mhm.
And so you might go, oh, he's feeling stupid, so he's shameful. And actually, it's come down the line, it's something else. So this failure of communication, this is particularly true in romantic relationships. I told you how I was feeling. And we call this mind reading as well in psychology, that we have to make up what someone else is thinking and understand. And teenagers, you should have known what I was thinking, and blah, 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 blah. If we're not good at communicating this, we're going to get into all sorts of trouble. So we have to start to learn to communicate what I feel and articulate that. And we're never taught this, so it's not like we should know. It's difficult.
So you would change the language to I think, and the feeling, when I say I feel, it needs to be followed by a feeling.
Well, I mean, you actually did, when you said a feeling, and then you actually used the word helpless as a feeling. It's not a feeling.
It's not a feeling.
Helplessness is a belief that results in a set of feelings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Frustration
or depression. I mean, the belief, the cognition of helplessness or powerlessness is the root of nearly all depression.
Mm-hmm.
It's the belief that nothing I do makes a difference. I'm helpless.
Yeah.
And because I believe I'm helpless, I have these emotional responses that go with it. So that's an area that's really important. Someone's asking.
Sorry, just a really quick one. I understand that in the context of stupid, but could you just explain how that works with tiredness?
Okay, that's a great question. So it happens all the time in groups I run. I check in, I'm tired. Okay. You're tired because you've been up all night fretting? Or you're tired because you've just beaten your personal best in the gym? And it's nearly always I've been up all night fretting. So actually, because you're tired, what is it you're feeling? Well, actually, I'm feeling anxious, nearly always anxious. Whereas the other one would be pride. But saying I feel tired is not an emotional response. That's more of a sort of state, a body state. It's not an emotional response. When you are tired, what are you feeling? It's because just in modern day language we use feel. I mean, I notice it now with nearly everyone.
I would say bodily motion.
Yeah.
Sensation. Yeah, that's a good observation.
And just one last thing that I think is really important to understand about emotions is emotions work in a very similar way. There's this term in psychology called affect. And under the term affect comes sensation and emotion. The closest thing to an emotion is that people understand sensation, but emotion is the closest thing. If I get a pen and I stab myself, if I tap myself, I get a very light feeling. And if I go very hard, I get a very intense pain, probably. The level of sensation is directly related to the level of input going into that.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing with emotions, but it's actually your emotions, the strength of the emotion is determined by the amount of threat or positivity towards that, to the strength of the value associated with that. And that's another really essential, fundamental to understand. It's like, I'm sad that there are people starving in the world, but if that was on a sort of scale, I'm sad about it. If I bring my, it's because I have a general benevolence towards people. But if my daughter's starving, that's a complete, I value her, I value them more than any of you. If you're hungry, different thing to they're hungry. It's my values hierarchy determines the strength of the emotion, the threat to, or if she draws something, the pride or the love I feel is completely different to if you do. So my values hierarchy determines the strength of my emotional response. And that's another key that people need to begin to understand and have as a foundation to all of this in relation to emotion and how emotions work and where they come from.
Another point I want to make about the fact that there are no bad emotions is that I think about it as what I call protective emotions, because they're trying to protect a value, and one of the things that I think about is the connection Rand's made between the body responses and the conceptual responses of life. And I want to bring up the the idea of repression. Because I don't know about you, I was a chronic repressor because I would get waves of emotions and I was saying it's bad to feel it, so I'm gonna shut it away. It doesn't exist. It will go away if I push it, right? So when she says she has this point that she's making about it's the same. It's a conceptual equivalent of the pain pleasure mechanism, right? It's just joy or pleasure. And repression, my good friend Gina says, repression is like tampering with evidence. It's so you put your hand on a stove and it's like, oh my God, this was hot. And repression is like my hand is burning, I'm in pain, I'm gonna ignore it, right? So for me, that's repression. It's like you're getting signals. Now the thing about the difference between conceptual and more physical is that where's the signal coming from? As I said, sometimes the value judgment could be detrimental to your happiness, and you have to validate that. By the way, is it good to go to the dentist? Right? Well, for kids, it's not. Try to convince them to go to the dentist, they won't go. But as an adult, it's like, yeah, I'm gonna, withstand that pain because it's a good thing. So even on a bodily sensation, you can override it by saying, no, this is good for me. I'll relax and it'll be fine. The gym. Yeah. Oh my God, another pull-up. So what do you think about the process by which we are trained in a way by our culture? And I think it's a disease that mainly on the male side we're experiencing. But it's like repressed our emotion. Where is it coming from, and what are the prices we're paying?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and it's a great question to ask the English. I'm a product of the English boarding school system where not only are you encouraged to do that, but you have to do that to survive. Mm-hmm. You show an emotion in a boarding school and you're done for. And there's this whole thing called boarding school syndrome, which is a very real thing. It's like kids from a very young age learn to shut down and repress their emotions completely, and then it's very tragic what's happened with the boarding school culture system. Is that you're getting very able, very well educated kids who cannot hold down and function in relationships, intimate relationships. And this is
impotent when it comes to
impotent expressing. So for example, for a long time I could only cry in films, the end of films. That was and music. They were the two things that it would come out. Otherwise I was expert at shutting it down, repressing. And one of the saddest things, like in the work that I do, is that we often talk about in psychology that the shutting down was adaptive. It was a good. It was a value. It allowed little Johnny not to be bullied, but the long-term effects of it are tragic. So repression is a huge amount of the work I'm doing is allowing people to learn how to tolerate feeling as well. So there's this concept comes from someone called Dr. Andrew Leeds. It's been really useful in my work, called positive affect tolerance. Learning how to tolerate positive affect is something that so many people really struggle. Why do so many people sabotage something good? Because they've never experienced feelings like that before, and it's completely overwhelming. And I can give you an example that I think there isn't a little cushion around or anything, is there? I'll use my scarf. Okay. I thought this was brilliant. I use this hat. How many of you, anyone here never been to a playground and seen usually a dad throwing their kid up pretty high and catching them? Anyone not seen that? So you all know what I'm talking about. Yeah. And father and the kid, and it's usually pretty high, and I'm a bit like, oh God. The father and the kid are completely well attuned. The kid totally trusts the father. There's that one of the bonds happen like that. Again, more and more, And you can imagine another kid wanting to come over and having a go, and they do that, and the first thing they do is burst into tears and run. And the really sad thing about this is that the kid that runs, the reason they run is because that was too overwhelming for them. The intimacy, the fun of it. Because the father and the child didn't start off like that. It started off like this, over months and months and months. Kids need to learn how to tolerate positive emotion as much as negative emotion. And this is why so many people get into romantic relationships later on, and the repression and causes them to run, even though the last thing they want to do is that, but they're so overwhelmed from years of repression. So it's a great tragedy. You see babies when they turn their head away, seen that when they get all excited and then they turn away and they come back in? They're regulating the amount of dopamine they're getting. They're learning how to tolerate the good feelings. So they're really into it, they turn away and then they bring themselves back in.
What about negative tolerance? Can you talk a little bit about my ability to hold a state where I'm going through rough times and I cannot hold it? Because I think what my experience that, you know, VCs, when they invest in entrepreneurs, one of the things they talk about is that what is the level of fortitude and tolerance that entrepreneur has? How much pressure can they withstand before they break? And if, let's say, they break, how soon are they back on their feet? How would you think about that level of tolerance, of like pressure, or just things are not going well? Can I carry myself through the period of now I'm going through a rough patch?
So, and what I'm hearing is we're talking about resilience there.
Resilience, yes.
Yeah. So resilience is one of my favorite topics, and something that I work a lot with people. And resilience is my favorite definition of resilience in psychological terms comes from Karen Rivich, which is the capacity to draw upon internal and external resources when you need it.
Mm-hmm.
So someone who is in that sort of situation, you almost have to have a mastery of repression, as long as you allow yourself to go to it later. So in CBT, there's all sorts of techniques that people can use, but one of my favorite ones that makes me smile is it's like a worry appointment. That you have got a whole load of things you need to worry about that are on your mind, and you say to yourself, I'm going to really worry about this at 6 p.m. tonight. But it sounds funny and kind of cute, but there is something really important about that. What that person is saying is, I'm acknowledging these feelings, I'm acknowledging this stress, I can't deal with it now, but I know I need to deal with it. So they're able to, so I'm always looking at what are your resilience skills. So what self-care have you got in place? What are you doing this weekend? How's your sleep? How's your nutrition? How's your hydration? You know, what are the sort of things that you can, what art are you consuming right now to give you the strength to come through this? So there's kind of like professional repression, and then there's kind of amateur repression. And if you can repress professionally while acknowledging that, okay, right now I'm going to have to shut all this off, but I'm going to have to feel this later, versus I'll take a pill, switch it all off.
Yeah, because to bed.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in addiction treatment for years, and that's the ultimate form of repression. Is you were talking about the hand on the stove, or everything is. I'm going to cut off all feeling to everything, and then is always going to come. So someone who is resilient understands that the feeling is going to come, and I'm going to have to deal with this. But I also have the skills to work with it now. So it's the difference between being stoical and being rational, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Completely. I think it's a very interesting view of this, and how you connected the two ideas together. For me, repression was, like you said, shutting down, almost like shutting down a nerve. Yeah. And like Gina said, tampering with evidence. I wouldn't even take the input that something's wrong. And then you suppress, repress it, and then it. I think what's going on is that we build like psychological pressure that then kind of bursts out somewhere else. I don't know what your experience is, but there are dear prices for repression. I mean, you build all kinds of I think areas in your personality where it's almost like scar tissue, where you're trying to avoid the pain. Again, I just hurt my calf. I tore some of the muscle there, and it was amazing to me that I was limping very, very hard. So I walked into the physical therapist office, and we did a couple of exercises, and it's all bruised up. I mean, it's really bruised. And she says, "Oh, can you lie on your back? I'm going to massage it." I said, "Don't you dare touch it. I mean, what are you talking about? Like, I'm limping, like, just to avoid the pain." And she said, "No, trust me, it'll be fine." So I'm lying there, I just take kind of so she starts to massage the place very gently. And it's like, yeah, I can tolerate that. And then she goes a little deeper with her thumbs, a little deeper. And she goes to the point where I know the tear is. And I'm like, I'm going to now cry from pain. And it feels like she's going to like a place where the scar tissue is starting to build. And she's literally breaking scar tissue. I was like, wow, I can tolerate that. I can tolerate that. And it dawned on me that the body has trained itself to just close up and limp my way. I just stood up. It's like, I'm not going to limp anymore. I'm going to walk slowly because this muscle is weak, but I'm not going to limp. I'm going to walk normally. And I could do it. And and so I went back home and I introspected a lot about, I think that's what's going on in my mind in some cases, because there's a lot of scar tissue from, I don't know, past traumas and things like that. And the way I've created is like, I'm going to avoid by limping around it and creating all kinds of defense mechanisms not to break the scar tissue. Because if I want to deal with the fact that somebody slapped me so hard when I was 7 years old and I decided that the world is dangerous, this is why I'm not allowed to take too many risks, and that's where my anxiety is coming from, I'm not going to go deal with that. And so if you're not breaking the scar tissue, you're going to limp around it in all kinds of defense mechanism, awkward ways. So this was like a physical representation of how protective we become. So I don't know if that analogy works for you. But
it does. I'm going to just give you another concrete way of looking at repression.
Yeah.
Lovely that you brought that up. It's just reminded me. So something I came up with, but I think it's very, very... I invite all of you to bring your hand right up close to your face. Closer, right up. And if you try and focus on that, what starts to happen? It gets painful, right?
Yeah.
It gets painful, it does your head in.
Yeah.
So this is something that's really, that needs dealing with it, but instead of dealing with it, you're going to repress. What options do you have with that right up in your face?
Closing your eyes.
You can close your eyes, and then how do you live? It's pretty hard, but you can close your eyes. You could, and let's say we cannot move the hand. What other option do you have? You can go like this.
Yeah.
And you can get by for a while like this, right? And then what's going to happen over time? Neck's going to seize up. You're going to start getting all sorts of issues with that. So then you've got to deal with that and that. But that's what repression does to you over time. So it will cause, yeah, you can function, not as well as you would be otherwise, but you can convince yourself that you're functioning. And then what we need to do is that. You can't just do that. The work is that. But we can get, and then we have all sorts of issues with that, calcify, and that's really what repression, and the same analogy works for a traumatic memory that you just don't want to look at or deal with. It's there all the time, so you can do this, and that's why you can do 20, 30 years of looking away, but eventually the neck will seize up. So yeah, repression is very dangerous, but we have many ways of, but also bringing some self-compassion to this is important sometimes. Was the repression adaptive? Did I need to do that? Like, particularly when you're kids, like there's certain things that we just have to adapt in a way.
So it's like the motivation by love that I think about. It's and I like the analogy because it's like, let's say I'm in this state, before I can go back looking at it, it's like I love myself enough to now do the work and the pain that is going to cause me to push through it and slowly push away. And so it's more like reminding myself that this work is worth it because I'm motivated by self-love and and I don't know, when I talk to other people about the fact that before we start doing the work, let's remind ourselves, why are we doing this? Because I care about myself. I want my life. And so the power of envisioning a world where, let's say I'm stuck here, but can you imagine a world where you're like this and you can, oh wow. And that power of imagination, I think, with a lot of people that I work with, creates the motivation to start doing the work, because it really hurts at the beginning. You're stuck like this, and just moving your head back will cause a lot of pain. Not to mention to relive some of the traumas and being that state. And so, yeah.
I think someone here had their hand up.
Yeah.
I think you both kind of.
Can you stand up?
I think you kind of both covered it. But when you set up the idea of increasing tolerance for positive and negative affects, I thought it was quite helpful to hear about how you would do that. And I think so. You covered kind of passion and self-love, doing it slowly, giving yourself time. But any other kind of like, how I understood it correctly, but also how would you do that? How would you increase your tolerance for positive aspects?
It's a great question, and you're using that word tolerance there's Daniel Siegel and Pat Ogden, who are quite famous psychologists in the field of trauma and healing for trauma, talk about what they call a window of tolerance, and nearly all the work is about widening that window. So the window of tolerance is all the feelings and thoughts and sensations and images that you can tolerate while still having agency. And if you tip out of that window, you either become fight and flight or frozen or dissociated. And all of what we're doing, what resilience is teaching people, is to widen that window so that you can tolerate more and more and more. And there's all sorts of techniques like breath. There's certain things with breath that you can do. There's kind of like, we need skills to be able to use in the moment. And then there are so like, think of it an analogy like with sport. We need to play the game and have the techniques to play in the game, but we also need to do the training on the side as well. And resilience requires both. But there's one of the best ways of resetting your nervous system is to breathe in for 5 seconds and out for 5 seconds, and just to just allow yourself to do that primarily through the nose if possible, because then you absorb more oxygen if you breathe through your nose. There's all sorts of techniques we can do. There's listening techniques. It really depends on the context. I'd want to know the context to be able to offer the tools, but we have to divide between in the moment things and things that increase our mental fitness.
One technique that worked for me, because I had those compulsive thoughts that I would find myself talking to myself, that gets me into a state, is really distract myself, like literal ways. So there was one technique that had a pen involved, where I would think a thought, is like, okay, it's starting again, this routine of thinking that thought. So I would raise a pen and say, wow, here's a pen. It's a blue pen. I'm writing with that pen. It's a great pen. I love that pen. It's an amazing pen. So just this idea of knowing it trained me to identify the start of compulsive behavior or thinking and distracting myself to the point of like, I can do this. So, and it trained me to like, I'm not even starting it. I don't need the pen anymore. I'm just like, I'm not thinking this. I know it's a stupid thought. It's coming from somewhere. I don't know where from. Sometimes it's really an unresolved issue, because it takes a lot of work. I have to, when I started doing this shift, I literally retrained my mind for about 2-3 years. Between reading Rand and thinking I'm the only weird person in the world who gets what she's saying, to the point where I met other people, just like, oh, there are other crazy people in the world. I went to an OCON, but I literally felt like I'm dragging myself on the floor mentally to try and undo a lot of thinking and false premises. And part of it was like psychological. So I I actually went to a couple of therapists, but they had no clue. I mean, my expectations like help me work this in that level of understanding. I think what I'm hearing here is this is the kind of therapist that I would like to have. Someone who really has a philosophical foundation that explains all of that, right? So it is hard work. I mean, when I talked about talking to myself in the shower, was another technique to say I have to deal with this. And let's say I remember that I realized that there's something about starving that triggers me. And I realized that it has to do with my early childhood where I was born pretty, not well off. So I didn't really starve, but I had this idea that at one point food can stop coming and it triggers a lot of survival mode, anxiety, and so on and so forth. So let's say I know that about myself. So what do I do with it? Because this is the reason why I don't start companies. I mean, people offer me to be an entrepreneur. I say no, and I find reason not to do it because it's too much risk, or if there's too much change that I cannot hold. It took me months to figure out the self-talk that really started making it the difference. To say you're never going to start. So I'll give you an example. So I sat down and I said, how can I prove to myself that I'm never going to start? So let's say, how much is food for a day? So I calculated how much money it is. I'll multiply that with the amount of days that I have to live between now and let's say 9 years. I have more money than that. So that was like talking to my 4-year-old, as I call it, in a rational way. And that actually helped. It's like every time I'm going to tell myself I'm going to starve or my family's going to starve, it's like, it's bullshit. It's never going to happen. Stop thinking that. Not in a negative way. It's like, relax. Another idea, which is an attitude, the reason why I call my subconscious mind is my 4-year-old, it's like, what do you feel about your 4-year-old? You love them. Even when they make crazy stuff, like you said, my kid is crazy, right? But I love them to death. So that's how I treat myself. It's not shut up, you're a loser, stupid, whatever, how people talk to themselves, right? It's like, no, I love you. I see you're doing something wrong. Let's fix it. So it's really the attitude that really helped me over time to stop the negative self-talk.
So Tal mentioned two things there: distraction techniques, which is there's a form of therapy called ACT therapy that really looks at the most useful thing I found from ACT therapy is the distraction techniques they talk about. I mean, and DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, as well as another one. One of the famous things to do if you're having these ruminating thoughts is have an elastic band around your wrist and you just ping the elastic band, or slap your hand on the wall. These are distraction techniques, and then we need to have the deeper techniques, which are what you're talking about, was Seligman would talk about in his Learned Optimism book. Imagine that you're in a court of law, and the only thing you can go on in a court of law is evidence. So what you were doing there was looking at the evidence, and often with the help of a therapist, what are the actual facts of your life that confirm or dispute this? And that's where the massive change happens. And then there's also other techniques you can use, like savoring, which is when you connect to positive memories from your past, because you can actually relive positive emotions. You can generate positive emotions from reliving positive experience in life through various certain techniques, and they can lift and help change you in that moment as well. And so there are different levels of technique we can use as well.
And yeah, just thinking with the work you're doing there, do you deal with the issue of self-sabotage?
Nearly the whole time. Self-sabotage, I mean, people are used the current zeitgeist phrase of self-sabotage is imposter syndrome. That I stop myself from doing this because I believe I'm an imposter, which seems to be used all the time at the moment. But self-sabotage primarily comes down either to, it's usually rooted in trauma, but on a fundamental level, it's all to do with self-esteem. And that's a whole subject that we could talk about for hours. But understanding self-esteem is really about understanding two fundamental questions: am I able and am I worthy? And the self-sabotage nearly always comes down to am I worthy? And most issues, so a lot of people I work with are incredibly talented, successful, hardworking people who are having crises. And the self-sabotage comes in, and it nearly always comes down to, when you get under the hood, is that they are living someone else's values hierarchy, that they're not living their own values. Nearly every time, it's like, you built this company, now you're destroying it, or you're about to hand in your thesis for your PhD, and you just won't write the references. And when you look under the hood, it's nearly always, I never wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be an artist, but my mum wanted me to be a doctor, and I made myself, and the crash happens. So it's nearly always the self-sabotage. I would always encourage them to really look at what are their values, what's the values hierarchy, and are you living your values or someone else's values? Because the self-sabotage is usually, I don't want to do this, because it's actually not who I am. That's hard for people to hear. It can be quite brutal, but that's what nearly always self-sabotage comes down to. It can be the other side of self-esteem, as am I able, and I don't actually believe I'm able. But it's much more the am I worthy area, and often it comes down to your values hierarchy or unresolved trauma.
And I just want to complement that by saying that it took me a long time to say, okay, so what's the alternative? And the toughest process that I think it has to do with building your happiness is to gather evidence over time about what it is that you find meaning in. Because people have a void to say, okay, I'm just realized I don't want to be a doctor or whatever. So now they can't even imagine a world where I'm not doing this, because it's entangled with their identity, who they are, and how they built their lives. So I think the positive is there's, and maybe we'll compare notes about other things later on, but I've built a whole sequence of techniques that allows you to rationally build a hierarchy of values according to proof. Not to what I think, but what am I actually responding to? Because a lot of people will say, oh, I love this. And like you said, when was the last time you did it? Oh, I can't even remember. But it's a thought. I would love to do that. It's like, where's your evidence? I don't have it. I just feel that I want to do that. So building rational values, which is the antidote to somebody else's values, it's not an easy task. It's much easier to absorb somebody else's values, to develop your own. Not only to develop your own, and then to develop the courage to actually say, because I know now this is a value to me, am I going to act on it? So I think the strategic issue is that we never teach ourselves and our kids to become true first-handed valuers. And it happens when you're, like you say, look at kids. Look at kids. They're just amazing natural valuers. They would go to what interests them, and they will shut off everything that doesn't interest them. They will be completely rationally selfish, but then we beat it out of them to say, oh, don't do this, don't do that, that's too risky. Give your toy to the other kid. And that is childish. That is the worst, by the way. And if you ever read the Comperchicos, which is a mind-blowing essay by Rand, it's like you beat it out of them. You deform them by extracting the valuer out of them and saying, life is not about values. Life is about duty and to do what we tell you to do. And this is where you suck the life out of them. And once they realize that later on, when they have all that trauma, it's like, but I don't know how to do it. So give me an alternative. I meet a lot of people in the middle of late in their lives, and they're realizing I'm living somebody else's life, but what's the alternative? Do you want now to build my own life? That's impossible. That is too hard. So there are techniques where that I've developed for myself, and then try to kind of abstract it a little bit so it becomes like a generic thing. But the idea of, I call it, the first thing I do in the happiness team is self-observation. It's like first log, don't judge, don't assume, log what's actually happening, and then prove to yourself that this is, wow, I'm doing a lot of that. I'm really curious. Why am I doing a lot of this? Again, I think the step before all of that trauma and all of the second-handedness is that we just don't have the value or muscles that we should have built. She calls it, it's where our wings should have been, that they cut it off, right? And this is the shackles of duty. So we have to grow wings, and that's hard.
And what you said there about your own, Karen Rivich, who's excellent on resilience, she speaks about values at one point. And there's a lot of emphasis on values actually in University of Pennsylvania. But she was talking about how she loved art. Loves art, she loves art. And this example, her husband just went, what do you see? When did you last go to an art gallery? When did you last? And she was like, I realized that I was just trying to impress, just trying to be something. People say they love art, and I was thinking, oh, well, I want to be like those people who say they love art. I don't love art, actually. I love
Cooking,
whatever. I can't remember what the example was, but then she said that was one of the most defining points of her life, was her husband busting her, what her actual values are versus what her values should be. And that's something that really destroys so many kids, is when I see, particularly teenagers teenagers really want to be moral. They really want to be, and they have these values that they're put on them, and they break. And I reckon, fast forward 10, 15 years, let's see what happens to poor old Greta, because she's not living her values. Those are clearly her parents putting this on her, and we're going to see a broken child. She's so miserable, and you don't need to be an expert to see that. But so self-sabotage, repression of your own values. This is all we got to lift that up if you want to have a decent shot at being happy.
Yeah, Pavel, maybe.
So actually, this raises an interesting question for me, because a lot of these things resonate, of course. And then you mentioned that kids are natural value worse. But I think the other type of error you can make are these out of control kids, right? Or people who all over the place. So how do you combine these perspectives? What sort of guidance do you give? Not to repress, not to overwhelm, or kind of and come across
not dying in the process.
So that's not the way. But then if you go completely hands off, or everything you feel, everything you say, that's great. It's I think that's the other type of errors. So how do you balance these things to have a rational, directed, and fulfilling going?
There's so many. That's a sort of year-long seminar. But to one thing, ideally send them to Montessori, because that provides the environment for them to be true values within a boundaried. And the amazing thing about Montessori as well, which in terms of happiness, is if you get a chance, read the Montessori Mafia article that was in the Wall Street Journal about how many of the top CEOs in Silicon Valley went to Montessori schools. But the important point there is Montessori also sets kids up to be in flow all the time. Flow states is the optimal state that we can possibly be in. And Montessori didn't know about flow states, but she picked it up in terms of set up for that. So healthy bound, and that's the beautiful thing about the Montessori system, is it allows freedom within very healthy, strong boundaries, and that's what you need to give kids. Another thing for children's development is absolutely essential, which Angela Duckworth really puts forward. She didn't invent this, but something that she really puts forward. She wrote a famous book called Grit. And she says that we must tell kids how talented they are. We must emphasize how much effort. So if a kid comes up to you and has drawn a picture, don't say to the kid, wow, look how talented you are. Say to the kid, look how much effort you put into that. Because talent is meaningless compared to effort. And when a kid has put effort, is rewarded for the effort they put into it. It directly ties into their esteem. But if we're telling kids it's all to do with their talent, and the talent is just something that they have from the gods on high, and it's not really there.
Right?
Yeah.
Or just the outcome of your work. So
Yeah.
you're tied to the outcome and not the process or the identity.
But healthy boundaries, Montessori, that's one angle. Is there another angle that you would say?
Yeah, for that, there's an amazing talk that Rebecca Gurn gave in, I think, two Ocons ago. She showed a video of a kid that just came to their Montessori classroom for the first time. The kid goes into the classroom and he just takes chairs and throws them away, bangs on the wall, just completely out of control. And her mom said, look, he's like that. We're trying to take to ADHD therapy and blah. They said, don't do anything. And then the same kid 3 weeks later is holding a bowl of fruit and taking one fruit at a time and putting it in all of the plates on the table. And he's consumed with the idea that he's now working. It's like, it's not the same kid. And we're talking about I think it was 3 weeks or something like that. So the power is, the question is, what are you going to raise your kid as a wild animal or as a human, right? Do you have the boundaries? Do you have the work and the power of purpose, which I think is what Montessori gives you? First, you are in the center of the Montessori system. You are the center. We are interested in you as an individual, not like a public school where all 40 of you are the same. I'm gonna talk to you about the same things in the exact same format because you're all the same. I call it like education for ants, not humans, right? Montessori is the opposite. Montessori is like you're the center of it, but there are rules, right? There are rules, and we won't tolerate it. And by the way, the person who's going to do most of the education is yourself. You're going to self-regulate. We're not going to hold you and punish you, right? So there's so much power in that, and I think this is why Rand thought so highly of Montessori, because you have to be a real philosopher of education to understand the underlying principles of what it means to raise the human, qua human. So, like you said, we can talk about it for a long time, but of course, yeah. Oh, I think there was
Last question.
Oh, last, but we have to
Because
go.
that person had their hand up a lot as well.
Oh, okay.
Can we do two?
Let's do two. Okay. So start here and then we'll go there.
So I was wondering if you guys could comment about the relationship between happiness.
Can you stand up?
So if you guys could comment about the relationship between happiness and contentment. So the contrast between saying this is how it is now and I'm happy with it and I don't need more, and then what you were talking in your previous lecture about how you're striving for something, so striving towards something versus just being happy with things as they are.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. You want to start? Or?
But my first that I went to is content would be on the emotions chart. So I see content as one of the emotions, is an emotional response. If we're thinking of happiness as a state, content is one of the many emotions that we can feel as a happy person. But I don't know the context, so I was listening to your talk.
Yeah, maybe I'll talk about it. So first, I completely agree. It's more like the this is short term versus long term. I mean, one of the things we don't appreciate is that happiness is about the journey. It's really about the journey. So think about you climbing a mountain, and he said that mountain is really important to me. I want to climb that mountain. And 99% of the time, you're going to be somewhere in the middle. And people always look forward on the gap versus Dan Sullivan called the gap versus the gain. And one of the things we do is like, oh, I'm not there yet. I'm not there. I'm frustrated. I'm not going to be happy till I get there. versus like, where am I? It's like, oh my God, look at how much ground I covered in the last 3 months. That is great. Where can I be in 3 months, right? I'm going to be somewhere. So the whole attitude of the bad attitude of contentment is like, I'm not going to be content until I make that happen. So that we should get away from. You should be content in the journey. Is the journey going in the right direction? And the way I talk to myself about the journey is like, this is where I should be now. I'm far away from completing my book. But if I continue to do what I'm doing right now, I'll have a book, right? Versus I don't have the book yet. I don't have the book yet. I'm going to. So, and there's nothing wrong about celebration when you're there. One of the things, again, people don't do, it's like, oh yeah, I've done that. What's next? It's like, wait a second. You just climbed the mountain. You know, take that time, celebrate, appreciate, shout it out, be proud. You know, when I first finished my first book, that's what I felt. It's like, oh my God, you know, when the first copies made it, I actually made a celebration. I invited people and it's like, I want to celebrate the fact that now I have a book with my name on it. So there's a lot of aspects here. If we're talking about how to be content and in the context of the almost the practice of extracting more value out of the investments you're making into the effort, is yeah, be content. But again, have the perspective of like, first, I'm content with the fact that I'm working towards a goal. Be content where you achieve the goal. By the way, I'm very content when I completely fail, because if I can learn something, I'm content. Like I've tried it. We tried something in the institute for a while, and it's like, let's do this methodology is going to work for us. And I pushed everybody like for 2 months. Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. Completely flopped. I mean, I was wrong about all the assumptions there, right? And it's like, are you frustrated? It's like, no, it's fine. And now I know what not to do, right? So it's almost like, again, like a perspective, a benevolent perspective on. But again, like I just said, you know, if you look at being happy, it's way more than that. It's aggregation of a lot of contentment. I think we're running out of time.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, Tal is still here, so you can ask him the question during the break. But yeah, we are behind schedule, so we have to take a break, and we'll be back in 25 minutes with Nikos. Why the right is not the answer. So.
Thank you, guys.